Hi, this is Mike Cole. I'm recording this presentation in San Diego on a few days before your conference there in Moscow, and I look forward to seeing you face to face tomorrow, Tuesday morning, my time, and Tuesday evening, your time. My plan today is simply to present the first part of a rather long presentation that relates to my current work on the design of developmental educational settings for children and the notion of proximal development. And in it, I don't take up, I think in it, it will be evident to you all that I'm quite interested in trying to have a dialogue between Russian and non-Russian psychologists interested in Vygotskian developmental theory to clarify a variety of issues associated with the notion of proximal development. This presentation is done today more or less highlighting a number of ideas that are popular in the United States, some of which I'm critical of, and then to give a couple of illustrations of work that you can read about if you're more interested in it. The entire PowerPoint is available to you folks there in Moscow, but the sound in my presentation today only goes through 25 slides. My assumption is that that will take up all the time we have. So I'm very happy to be able to present to you and looking forward to a discussion of these ideas tomorrow. Let's see, some of this will be very old to some of you. English will be very new to some of you. Russian will be very new to some of you. So let's hope the PowerPoint and this modality actually work for you. So first of all, we have to start off with problems of definition and interpretation. And that's where a lot of the discussion goes on. A lot of issues come together here, but the definition here is taken from the set of essays, excerpts from Vygotsky's work published as Mind and Society in the United States in 1978. And this definition can be found elsewhere. Zone of proximal development as the distance between an actual developmental level in independent problem solving, and the level of potential development is determined through problem solving with a more capable other, so adult guidance or collaboration. That's the English translation. It can be found in Higher Psychological Functions and other things in Russian and English. Now, there have been a variety of Russian interpretations of the zone of proximal development and a lot of misunderstanding, some of which I myself contributed to. And let me run through what some of those are and how they're used. So first of all, it's routine these days to read articles that are very critical of the notion of zone of proximal development, saying, oh, all that means is that you're giving the kid the amount of help they need and not too much help. And that's all you're talking about. That's the assistance assumption. And Vygotsky himself wrote that right at the beginning of the discussion on zone of proximal development that everybody knows that with collaboration, direction, some kind of help, the child's always able to do more. So there's no news in that. The question is, what's the news in bringing in big words like zone of proximal development? So we want to answer questions like, well, precisely what are the dynamics of in the zone of proximal development? When does it work and when doesn't it work, and how does it work? A lot of discussion about where is the zone located. A zone is a spatial metaphor. Where's time in the zone? So people like to talk about that. And then, is a zone of proximal development only to be seen in schools? Only when there's deliberate instruction of scientific concepts? I've heard Russian colleagues who are heads of institutes in Russia say that that's exactly what is meant. So there's disagreement on the Russian as well as American side, but I'm very interested in outside of forms of interaction that would qualify as zones of proximal development. Not all forms of interaction would. So, what about mechanisms? Well, one of the mechanisms that Americans are fond of is what we're calling here next step approaches. So, the general idea is clear. You have a sequence of complexity in some conceptual domain, and what you want to do is to organize instruction so that the child is presented with exactly the next level. And this idea you can find in print in this year, or it's fairly common to encounter it. It's used widely, particularly, I think, in mathematics education and in second language learning, presumably because these are fairly highly structured conceptual domains. Everybody has notions about sequencing, and that makes the sort of movement through presumed stages and their sequencing codable, and therefore, presumably, you can organize around that code to do something. But we have to ask the question, once you've done that kind of thing, is the existence of some domain-specific logical sequence sufficient to account for the dynamics of developmental change? And it's presumably, we'll get into this, but presumably development is going on here. And what does it mean when you mix the logic of domain-specific stage-like changes together with very general psychological factors that are domain general? What happens then? And I don't think we have a good answer to that question. So another metaphor that people like, and it's maybe the most widely used term in conjunction with the zone of proximal development, is scaffolding. This comes out of work that David Wood in England did. First article I know of is in 1966. And it's a version, I think, of give as much help as the kid needs. That's basically what he was trying to say. And myself, along with Peg Griffin and others in the West, have criticized the scaffolding metaphor as a deep misunderstanding of Vygotsky and issues of learning and development, because it really, as people use it, amounts to this sort of next step thing. You're at step N, what's step one? Scaffolding is used in English in the United States for things like building brick buildings, where you think of the wall going up and the workers are going one brick at a time up the wall, and hanging people. So those are the scaffolding. I don't like scaffolding much as a metaphor for development in either version of it. And I think it's missing something, and I ask questions about it. People, you can use it, and we know what people mean. But where does planning get done, and where does the responsibility for planning reside? It can't be next to the scaffold in the architectural building thing. It's probably in some architect's office across the way, right? In some cases, their scaffolding is being built, like Chartres Cathedral goes over 200 years. So what does it mean? Where sort of disassembling mind. So I think there are real problems. If we want the scaffolding metaphor, it's going to have to be expanded. And in the last 20 years, 40 years, I guess, I haven't seen any expansion to speak of. But I'm sure there are ones, and it's just that I'm looking elsewhere. So with I think, talking now Americans, I won't take responsibility for the rest of the world outside of Russia, but certainly Western or American, whatever term you'd like to use. Psychologists have had a lot of trouble understanding zone of proximal development because they don't really make a strong distinction, or cannot maintain a strong distinction between learning and development. And this comes up in my experience over and over and over again. This is not just a single theoretical problem. This is an international, linguistically mediated and meta-theoretical problem. It's not going to be easy to untangle this, but we know what some of the components are. So we know that a zone of proximal development, which I refer to as a ZOPED, it's easy to say in English. ZOPEDs refer to the organization of experience such that learning leads development. And I put it that quite generally that way, even though we automatically start to think about formal instruction in schools. In contrast, now, a zone of proximal development with Piaget, for whom development is supposed to lead learning, and American learning theorists, for whom development is simply a lot of learning. And you can see it in learning sets, you can see it in a variety of learning mechanisms, and qualitative change is not necessary to think about. But from Vygotsky's perspective, or Piaget's perspective, or a lot of people's perspectives, that's wrong. What you're looking for is qualitative reorganizations within the organism and between the organism and the environment. And in the environment, the whole system of interactions has to change. Okay, we can get the door. So the big issues then, the big issues that are left are how should learning and development interact over the process. So let's assume we agree with Vygotsky. How should learning and development interact over the process of appropriate instruction? Leading is one thing, but leading is interacting. That means there's got to be developmental processes and learning processes coexisting here. And then my other important question is, what other sociocultural arrangements, such as play, just to pick up on one for Vygotsky, may also function as zones of proximal development? So here in the next slide, I'm talking about learning, development, instruction, and the sources of confusion, and I've highlighted instruction. And I've highlighted that because I myself and other Americans who have written about zone of proximal development, particular essays on development of the school-age child or the preschool child, learning and development there, that I was not sensitive enough to the different meanings of the term, Russian term, that's used in these publications, obuchenia. Now, the difficulty is that obuchenia can be used legitimately in two different ways in Russian, right? One is as instruction, formal instruction, teaching. And the other, in a variety of settings, it can be used to refer to learning. Now here I am, spending all my time learning Russian as an American learning theorist, having never taken a course in development, so I'm biased to interpret things that way. I've written about this in an essay in Mind, Culture, and Activity. It turns out the Russians make the same error translating in the other direction. So I think this is a true point of international misunderstanding. But I do think we have to be very careful, and that I put at the bottom what I think is the key question. How can it be possible to organize the interactions between adult and child such that one step in development, развитие, is or two steps in development are created out of one step in learning, обучение? How could that be possible? And I'm pointing at the issue of transfer, and this is where Gestalt psychology comes into the picture and Davidov's ideas. But that's really the challenge for us all to think about. How do you arrange for that kind of multiplier effect in instruction, which I think is what everybody is looking for. So in the next slide, I'm not going to stop over this much, but I'm just pointing out, and American audiences, if they're not familiar with this, this is the kind of thing I think we all need to understand. Vygotsky was a developmental theorist, and his theory of development involved both quantitative and qualitative change, both periods of stability punctuated by crises and transitions. And that qualitative developmental change occurs during these crises and during these transitions through the interplay of the social situation of development, the emergence of neo-formations, new structures of psychological functions that rearrange the world for everybody, and then the idea of central line of development, where one of these kinds of functions is the leading one around which other ones organize, and what becomes leading at one time or another changes over the course of development. So it's very much a developmental systems theory. In the next slide, I summarize what he has to say on development, that we see rearrangements of the psychological functions studied earlier, and so on. And that this overall picture is one of a complex dynamic system, including the organism and the environment, and the change in the organism is coordinated with changes in the environment, or else the system is going to fail. Something's going to go wrong. Then we have examples of zones of proximal development. I guess I'm going to give just one example, and it's it's easy to understand in English, and the Russians know it, and the rest we really kind of don't have time for today. And it requires going up on the web and looking at examples. I have examples up there. Maybe you can email me, and I can send the URL for it. But let's just take the work of Manilenko, carried out during the period when Vygotsky's students were focused in Kharkov, and where Leontiev was interested in the idea of a parallelogram of development, zones of proximal development, leading activities, all of that kind of stuff are there. But it's very simple to understand as an example, and that is with Manilenko's work, where you take young children, let's say 3-year-olds, and you contrast them with 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds, roughly. And with one group, you give them the task of standing still as long as they can. So you just say, okay, Igor, stand still. Stand still as long as you can. This is a competition. Let's see who can stand still as long as you can. And all the little kids do that, and you time them. And then, either with the same kids in a counterbalanced order or with a different group of kids the same age, you say, okay, everybody, we're going to pretend like we're the honor guard outside of Lenin's tomb. Remember, this is 1939. Something like that. But even today, probably little Russian kids can imagine those guards standing stiff-legged outside of Lenin's tomb, and nothing gets them to move, and they stand there for hours. And so when you run the experiment, what you find is that little kids are itchy-scratchy, and the play doesn't help them at all to stand still. Play acting standing still doesn't do anything for them. The 5-year-olds, the play actually helps the 5-year-olds. They're itchy-scratchy too, but they are into play now, really. And they through the play, can master their own behavior and stand still. The 8-year-olds can stand still for a long time, and they don't need that play situation in order to be able to help them. All right? So what you have in that middle range then with the 5-year-old, you have the idea of parallelogram of development, but you also have this very tender zone of a zone of proximal development where you can think about, well, what are the reorganizations that must have gone on? Because standing still isn't just doing more of what you were doing. It requires now some kind of voluntary control, learning to control yourself from the outside through the play, then the 8-year-olds have internalized that, so they no longer need that. A nice example, I think, of a zone of proximal development, nice historical work by Ukrainian psychologists recently doing historical follow-ups on this sort of historical dimension of development. I think I've taken up about all of my time that you want me to. And if I were to go on from here, I would take up issues like really relating the zone of proximal development to the idea of method of dual stimulation. If you don't do that, I think it's pretty hopeless. And most Americans go, huh? When you mention method of dual stimulation. So my next couple of slides are saying, and I'm not going to rehearse that. If there are Americans there who don't understand what I'm talking about, ask a Russian sitting next to you. But then I go on to do something different, which is to generalize this notion of dual stimulation, which I'm doing, my colleagues in Helsinki have been doing for some time. We're looking at generalizing this principle in different directions. And for me, I'm looking at something that goes beyond two-person interactions which implicitly take IQ testing or psychological testing as a model. And Vygotsky was very concerned about that zone of proximal development came up in that context for him in a serious way in his critique of intelligence testing. And but I'm interested now, with having spoken with teachers and others, of creating entire large group activities that are zones of proximal development. Now, many people in Russia work at that within schools and do absolutely fine work. I work after school. I do that because I'm allowed to mix play, the other leading candidate for creating zones of proximal development, that happens to mesh with what children like to do after school, which is play, and then create systems of activity in which self-development occurs because the children participate happily in the activity. So I'm going to stop there, and this PowerPoint continues with lots of examples and so on, but you've been very patient if you've listened this long, and I'll look forward to seeing you on Tuesday morning. Thank you. Bye-bye.